Well, hello. I would like to welcome you to this presentation. This is going to be a little teaching that I put together here, and this is the premise of what I'm going to be teaching is, did the biblical Exodus happen? And if it did, when? And this is kind of a really contentious debate in today's culture, specifically within Christianity. And I am a Bible believing Christian, so I do believe the Exodus happened. And that's going to be the premise of what I'm going to talk about is the details behind that. But for believers, for Christ followers, let me explain to you why this is so important. If the Exodus did not happen, if the Jews kind of just made it up, it was a part of their cultural tradition that just came out of basically fairy tales, and that's how it developed. And they slowly developed this narrative over time. Let's say around the 7th, 8th, 9th century BC, and it really became codified when they got exiled into Babylon into written form. And there we have the Old Testament. This is the view of quite a bit of scholarship today. Actually believes it didn't happen, and that's kind of it just came out of a cultural narrative. It didn't really happen as it was stated. And because the reason for this is because when the archaeology behind it is really what it comes down to. Um, there we say one of my favorite movies here is Yul Brynner as Pharaoh Ramses the Great. He is the most powerful pharaoh, in my opinion, of all time. He reigned during the 19th dynasty, and yes, I said dynasty. I like the way the British say it; it sounds cooler, so I say dynasty instead of dynasty. And there you also see a bust of him from Egypt, and a wall painting, and that's the actor. And his reign, just like it says here, was from 1279 to 1213 BC. And because of this verse in the Bible, Exodus 1:11, where it says that the Jews built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, they make the assumption of tying the two together, that this is when the Exodus happens, sometime during his reign. They mostly put it around 1250 to 1240 BC, generally speaking. And this is thought to be the time of the Exodus. The problem is when you look at the archaeology, so if you start to look at for signs of the Jews in Egypt, let's say 50 years before or 100 years before Ramses came to power, or during his reign, you don't find any. There is no evidence of Jews anywhere in Egypt at all. And then you start looking at evidence for slavery and for the parting of the Red Sea, which is going to be hard to prove anyway because it's a miracle. But you start looking for archaeological things in the ground. Like for an example, you look at Jericho or Hatzor, which is two cities in the conquest, and you start to look at the archaeology there, and you see nothing. There's just nothing in the archaeological record for Joshua, for the conquest, for Moses, for Joseph, for the slavery of Egypt, for the Exodus. There's just nothing in anywhere from an archaeological standpoint. So that's where this comes from. And the question is number one, is this, as in this verse right here, Exodus 1:11, really doesn't say that the Jews built or that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt during the reign of Ramses. It does not say that. It says they built a city called Ramses, and it's an inference that that means that that was a city that Ramses himself had them build. Well, let's suppose it was Ramses' father who had them build it, and he had them built it for his firstborn son. So that means you skip one generation back. Or let's suppose it was some other pharaoh having the city built for his great great grandfather, the most powerful pharaoh of all time, and doing it in his name. Um, Again, you can make these kind of adaptations to the story because it doesn't directly say that the Jews were slaves during the reign of Ramses and that they left during his reign. That was when the Exodus happened. It's an inference. So we're going to dig into the Bibles and see what the Bible and see what the scriptures actually say in reference to a date, or if it says anything in reference to that when the Jews actually left Israel in the Exodus. And another thing we're going to examine is Egyptian chronology. Is it correct? Is it traditional chronology on which Pharaoh ruled at one time? Is it accurate to say this is this is something we should place our faith on, because a lot of people don't know this, but all of antiquity, from a chronological standpoint, all of it is based on Egyptian chronology. So the chronology for the Hittites, for the Amorites, um, which is the Hittites are up in Turkey, whether it's ancient Greece or the Minoans or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, everything is based off of Egyptian chronology. Um, you may, in the Hittite king list, know which ruler came before or after, but as in assigning that a date, that's going to be subservient to the chronology based on Egypt. So Egypt decides the date of everything. And in my opinion, this is a big problem. But that's the reality. So we're going to examine two sides of the coin. Side A is, what does the scriptures actually say about the Exodus, as in when did it took place? And do they give a date? So we're going to examine that. Secondly, we're going to look at Egyptian chronology and to see if there's any issues with it. And then we're going to actually reassess that, put the two stories together, and see if we can come up with the reality of what we have here from an archaeological standpoint and also a scriptural standpoint. Well, to continue what we were last speaking on, and one thing I did not mention that I do want to take the time to mention now is just how important this particular study is, because the reality of the situation is, within academia, the Exodus is a myth. So, and if you understand that, that this is where they're coming from, it's a total fairy tale. That makes the rest of Scripture a total fairy tale. So, and that becomes important for us as Christians today for one basic, simple reason. To the writers of the New Testament and to Jesus, Moses really existed. The Exodus really happened. Genesis, as an example, was a real book written about historical events. So was the Exodus. These were real events done by real people. And if all of it is just a made-up narrative, just evolving out of a cultural backdrop in ancient Canaanite, or ancient Canaan, I should say. That's the area of the Middle East where Israel is located. If it just was a cultural story that grew over time and eventually got codified in Babylon into written form, and that's what really happened. Jesus didn't know that, and neither did the apostles. So that means Jesus really wasn't the Word of God made flesh, really wasn't divine, wasn't pre-existent. The apostles were believing a lie, and so did Jesus. So that makes the whole Christian faith, including the Jewish faith, all of it a bunch of myth and meaningless. So that's why this is really important. We really need to know this, because this is a foundation that our faith is built on. So now getting back to business here, this is the Merneptah Stela. This is a piece of Egyptian propaganda that a pharaoh would have built after he went and did something, whatever that something is. In this case, it's a military conquest. And Merneptah is the son of Ramses the Great, which is the supposed pharaoh of the Exodus. So this is his son. Now, since Ramses lived so long, Merneptah took over. He was pretty old, so he didn't reign all that long because he was pretty advanced in age. But if you look at the date, 1208 BC is when this was done. 1208 could be 1206, somewhere in there is when this actual stela, when the events depicted on the stela took place. And there is a little statue of Merneptah. He's again son of Ramses the Great, and his reign was from 1213 to 1203. Again, he's the next pharaoh after Ramses in the 19th dynasty. And the issue with that is if you take the traditional view of the Exodus, around 1208 BC, it's right after or right at the end of the Joshua conquest, or maybe a few years after, and you really have a very much a disbanded people, definitely not codified into a people group, just at the best, you might have them. The tribes been dispersed into their different land allotments, but they're definitely not organized, and I wouldn't call them a unified people, neither would scholars. And the reason why this really is troubling to a lot of people is because of this. Down there on the bottom, where you see that little down here, the green, that's what I'm pointing to. Here's a blow up of it, and in Egyptian hieroglyphs, what this is referring to is Israel as a people group. This is a problem because if the Exodus happened at the time that the intelligentsia says it did, around 1240, 1250 BC, there is no way that Israel is a codified people group, because the other nations depicted here around Israel are real nations with a capital, a king, and all this kind of stuff you'd expect with a nation during the late Bronze Age. And according to the biblical narrative, this is definitely not the case, biblically speaking. So here we have a problem because that doesn't make a. In fact, it makes a 250 BC, 240 BC Exodus basically impossible. There is no way that is accurate. And again, this is based on not changing anything in Egyptian chronology. This is just looking at the facts we have from an archaeological standpoint. Okay, this is my opinion, the most damaging evidence for the view of the traditional chronology. And this is a statue relief, and it carries the name of the Berlin statue pedestal. It's the pedestal of a larger statue. And it's interesting, it was actually found in the basement of the Berlin Museum. It just shows you that in a lot of cases, we have a lot of stuff in storage in museums around the world that have not been gone through. As an example, cuneiform tablets, we've only gone through, which we have several 100,000 of them, we've only gone through about 8%. So there's a lot yet to be discovered that we already have sitting in museums, which is kind of ironic. But nonetheless, this is definitively dated to based on the kings that are reigning, or the pharaohs that are reigning in Egypt, to 1350 BC. What's interesting about it is what these name rings down here. Now, the name rings are these guys right here. So there is a nation, there's another one, and there's another one. So what makes this unique is what it says. The first two puts this military campaign. And again, these name reliefs were done in order, so it's based on geography. Why is Ashkelon and Canaan next to each other? Because they were one after the other in reference to a military conquest. So we know this is in the Levant, again, which is a name for the Middle East that's used as another name for it. Most people don't know that, so I wanted to give an explanation. If I say Levant, it's in reference to the Middle East. What's interesting is this one here, Israel, which basically makes the 1250, 1240 BC Exodus impossible. You can't have an Exodus if you're already there. And again, this is not some wandering nomads. This is a codified nation. And to me, one of the I guess the strongest way to put this is, if you were using here's an artist's reconstruction of this name ring, and if you were to use the available hieroglyphics that we can use within the way Egyptians use those to actually write, could this be reconstructed differently? And the answer is no. This is pretty much the only type of hieroglyphics that can be used to reconstruct this in reference to what we already have sitting here on this side of the name ring, to finish out the other third that's missing. This is pretty much the only way you could do it. And the other question is, with the available hieroglyphics that are used to reconstruct what we have in this third name ring, is there any other nation in the area that this could be representing? Otherwise, could it be a nation that's similar to Israel, sounds like it, or it be maybe, but not Israel? And the answer to that is, again, no. This pretty much puts the idea of a 1200 BC, 1250 BC, I should say, Exodus to rest. It really becomes something you really shouldn't even bother to look at. But it's still, from tradition, because tradition is so strong, has not gone away, and there really is no argument against this. Most people, the argument that they'll have to counter this is say, well, it can't mean Israel because Israel wasn't in the land of Canaan, wasn't in the Levant at that time. And which is kind of funny, because there's the name ring from an Egyptian statue pedestal that proves otherwise. But for most people, for a lot of people in academia, within secular and liberal scholarship, tradition is that powerful. They just ignore it. They just ignore it like it's not there. Yes. Does the Bible really say that the Exodus was during the reign of Ramses II? Earlier, I talked about this, but didn't really go into detail. Now, I want to dive into the scriptures and really see what the Bible has to say, not what tradition says, but what scriptures actually have to say. There again, this is the go-to verse for those that want to subscribe to a 1240-1250 BC Exodus, which mentions, and you can read it if you like, but it basically says that the Jews built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. It doesn't say that they did it during the reign of Ramses. Again, it's not very specific in its date. It's just an inference, and then you draw the conclusion. Well, Ramses must have been the pharaoh at that time. Um, but that doesn't say that. Nowhere does it even hint to that. But again, it's an inference. It's not really exact. But really, what we have going on here is this is an example of an edit of Scripture, meaning at a later date, after the reign of Ramses, and because after Ramses, when you look at the Egyptian king list, all the pharaohs after him, always of the 19th dynasty, which he's a part of, they always name themselves Ramses II, Ramses IV, and so on and so forth. So that becomes a really popular name for pharaohs, and the areas that Ramses rebuilt or built and renamed, because he did that quite extensively, and those pharaohs maintained that. So older names of cities or statues or temples and who built them took on a different persona. They took on the idea that it was Ramses that did it. So what we really have here is, I would guess, somewhere in the 800s BC, you have a editorial hand here, change in place names to a more relevant name that's used of the day, because no one knows what the ancient city of Ramses was before the pharaoh Ramses, and that city was called Avaris. Now, what proof do I have? Well, here's an example. Let me get to that. So over here to the left here, Genesis 47:11 is an example of that. This is in reference to when Joseph settled his father and his brothers in the land of Goshen. But instead of calling it the land of Goshen, they call it the land of Ramses. Well, Ramses for sure, and this is not even debatable, did not even exist at this time when Joseph was there. So what you basically have going on is, you have, instead of saying land of Goshen, people were more familiar, the Jews that were reading the Torah at that time, and again, my guess would be in the 800s BC, were knew that area as land of Ramses, not as land of Goshen. So they made it edit to make it more relevant to what's going on at the particular time. And this scriptures prove it right there. That's pretty much case closed. And to put some more nails on the coffin, if we go over here, and I'm going to read Judges 18:29, or at least go through it. You can read it on your own. What it basically is saying here is that the ancestors of Dan, when they took over Laish, which is really what the city was first called, it even says that right there in the verse, they renamed it Dan after they took it over after their ancestor, because it was the tribe of Dan. But there again, you have an example of this just above here in Genesis 14:14 of exactly what my point is. When Abraham was around, it was definitely called Laish. It was not called Dan. But again, they used a name that is more relevant for what's going on at the time. People don't know the city is Laish. They know it as Dan. So whenever the scriptures were being copied, this edit took place, because when the scriptures are first copied by Moses, probably during their wandering years, is whenever the original foundation of the scriptures are being put together. It was almost 100% for sure was called Laish. And then later on, after the tribe of Dan, the judges took it over, probably around the same time that you have this Ramses edit in the 800s BC, is where you have Laish taken out of Genesis 14:14, replaced by the name that the city was known at the time, which is Dan. So this is an example of place name changes to make the Torah or make the Bible, the Old Testament, more relevant to the readers of the day. And this is where this error comes in. But now the question is, do we have any definitive times that the Exodus is given, meaning where they actually give the number of years? And the answer is yes, we do. and it's right in here. This is in 1 Kings 6:1. It says basically that in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, there we have an exact date, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. So there we have, all you got to do is know when Solomon reigned, and we do, and just go backwards 480 years, and then you have a date. And this can't be, just to use a little bit of harmonization here, this can't be when Ramses was going on. So this inference here in Genesis 11, or excuse me, in Exodus 1:11, to a 1200 BC Exodus is in stark contradiction to 1 Kings 6:1, which is an exact date. And again, when you really look at the panorama view of Scripture, specifically and how these place names were changed to be more relevant to the people of the day, and again, this is going back probably to the 800s BC, when you understand that, then this contradiction of a 1445 BC Exodus, which is what 1 Kings 6:1 says, when you do the math on it, it doesn't stand in contradiction to Exodus 1:11. You understand what's going on. It harmonizes quite well, and the Bible is very specific about when the Exodus happened. It's not contradictory, and we even have more evidence of that. In this verse here in Judges 11:25, 25, and 26, this is a reference to Jephthah. He's one of the judges, and there you see his date that he was around about 1095 BC, and he's referring to the Jews already being in the land for the past 300 years. So if you do the math on that, that's basically 1400, 1395 BC, which is exactly backs up the 1445 Exodus against the idea of it being during the time of Ramses. And again, Exodus 1:11 doesn't even say that that's when the Exodus happened. It's an inference of two cities they were building. And because Ramses renamed Avaris, which is what the city was originally called, to Ramses, and by the time you fast forward and you have all these pharaohs named Ramses, nobody knows what Avaris is. It's a meaningless name to him. So you have to make the place name change. And it's the same thing with the land of Goshen. It's now called land of Ramses because nobody knows the history anymore. It's too many hundreds of years earlier. And again, to back it up, look over here, Genesis 14:14 and Judges 18:29, to show for sure right in the text that you have place name changes to make things more relevant. So when you harmonize that with the scriptures down here in 1 Kings 6:1 and in Judges 11:25, we have a definitive Exodus date of 1445 BC. So now this is what the unified message of Scripture is, not what tradition is, but what the unified message of Scripture is, that the Exodus took place about 1445 BC. Well, now that we've established when the Exodus took place, biblically speaking, otherwise what the Scriptures say date-wise, that the Exodus took place, which is 1445 BC, let's see how that synchronizes, if you were, or how it relates to, it may be a better way of saying it, to Egyptian chronology whenever you look at the two side by side. So first, let's take a look at some Egyptian chronology data. First thing here is an article here that an online article that came either from Colorado or Colorado State. The topic of the article is really not important. That's what's important, is it lists what is the traditional chronology that most, overwhelmingly, majority of scholars, secular and liberal scholars, would say is the Egyptian chronology. So we have a range for the New Kingdom, which is 1550 to 1070 BC, and then one for the third intermediate period, which is 1070 to 712. Actually, probably for the intermediate period, most scholars would actually take it probably down to 642. So it's just 50 or 60 years out. Not that big of a deal. But let me explain what those are. So the third intimate period, you can tell by the name that there's also a second and a first. These are what we would call dark age periods, where chronology is very difficult to assess because you have many dynasties that you have to determine, were they reigning at the same time, or were they reigning consecutively, one and then the other? This could make a huge, depending on how long the dynasty is, could make a huge chronology difference. And then that will affect the dating of the New Kingdom and all other kingdoms, like, for example, the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom. And there's also a second intermediate period, which is the Hyksos area. Again, this is another Egyptian Dark Ages. So really, where the issue is, or potential issue is in the Dark Age periods. You can really have some errors happen here. Also, when you have one dynasty taking over from another, let's say from the 12th to 13th, or from the 18th to the 19th, take your pick. That may not be as smooth as you think it is. It may be they coincide. Otherwise, one dynasty is falling apart, the other one gains power. Then you have them reigning simultaneously for maybe a few generations, and then one takes over from the other. This can be difficult to assess. It's not difficult to assess when you have good stable kingdom, or good stable dynasty, I should say, which pharaoh reigned before and after a specific pharaoh and how long they reigned. That's relatively easy to determine. What's difficult to determine is when you got a chaotic period of exactly how this lays out. And from that, we have a new, well, before we get into the new, here are the dynasties that are in question from the New Kingdom all the way down to the end of the third intermediate period. It's the 18th dynasty all the way down to the 25th. And like I was saying earlier, there is a new chronology that is adopted by, again, a very much minority, but Egyptologists have adopted this. This is called the new chronology, i.e., because it's new, and it has the New Kingdom from 1202 BC to 818 as its end, and a much shorter third intermediate period, 842 to 664, because a lot of these dynasties, like the 21st and 22nd, 23rd, 25th, are actually reigning simultaneously, not consecutively one after the other. And this makes a completely changes a lot of chronology. The question is, which one is right? So it was interesting. We had like it wasn't really a debate, but it was more of a discussion, but kind of a debate between Kenneth Kitchen, I should say, which is an Egyptologist, probably the best chronologer, or at least the most well known, as being kind of the authoritative person when it comes to Egyptian chronology, and happens to be, by the way, a devout Christian. And he adheres to this traditional chronology, not the new chronology. And David Roll, which is another Egyptologist, which is funny, he's an agnostic, he's not a Christian. So he's not trying to make the Bible fit into chronology, or into the Egyptian chronology, and try to twist things. He is just looking at Egyptian chronology. And his specialty is in the third intermediate period, and so is Kenneth Kitchen. And Kenneth Kitchen used to accuse Mr. Roll of being just coming up with weird ideas and junk science, we'll call it, or fake science, to use a modern euphemism. But what's interesting is, after his discussion between the two, Kitchen was asked what his opinion is now, and he says, "My opinion hasn't changed. I still hold to the traditional chronology ranges for the third intermediate period and the New Kingdom, but the science, or the archaeology that Mr. Roll is using, is sound. His methodology is sound. I just have a different interpretation." So basically what you have there is you have two Egyptologists that specialize in chronology, at the top of their game, as it were, looking at the same evidence but having a different conclusion. The question is who is right, and can we prove it? So that's what I want to dive into, is looking at is there any way that we can prove whether the new chronology, which you can see to the right over there, whether this is the accurate way of looking at things, or whether it's a traditional way of looking at things when it comes to Egyptian chronology. Just like I said here, who is right, and can we prove it? And the answer is yes, we can. Yes, we can prove it, but before diving into the new chronology proof, I want to go over some of the strongest evidence that is used by those who would adhere to the traditional chronology. I want to go through their strongest evidence that they would use to prove it, that the the new chronology is in error, as it were. So this is a big thing. So going back into the mid 1800s, what you have is these were Bible believing archaeologists. These that were specializing in Egyptology in the 1800s that came up with this synchronism between Shoshank I and Shishak, king of Egypt. The question is that should we uphold that synchronism? And we dive into the details of what Scripture has to say about what Shishak did and what the wall reliefs in Egypt say about what the military campaign of Shoshank to see if they're one and the same or if they're very different. So, yes, just like that says, is Shishak and Shoshank the same? My opinion is, and it's pretty much a close, open and shut case, as you'll see, that no, they are not. But let's go into the details to show that. So what we have here is some of the details about Shoshank's military campaign, and basically coming out of Egypt, he went up along the coast. He went into not Judah, where Jerusalem was at, but he went into the northern kingdom up here in Israel, and down here is all the cities and all the areas that he captured. And when he went up, and he basically went into a circle, and when he was down here, this is where Jerusalem should be, and it's not there, and which is a big deal because that's the biggest city in the area. In fact, in all of Levant and the Middle East at that time, it is pretty much a powerhouse. It's the wealthiest, it's the richest, it's the most fortified, and you would expect that if he came up, as it says over here, if he came up against Jerusalem, that would be in the wall relief, and it's not there. The only cities are mentioned in this military campaign are up in northern Israel and along the coast. But there are some more details that the Scripture gives about this particular campaign, and it's right here in 2 Chronicles 12, 2 through 9. And take you down to verse 4, and that's the really key thing. It says, "And he," referring to Shishak, "took the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem." So the fortified cities of Judah are down here. None of them are mentioned in this wall relief. Zero. At all. So it really is two different military campaigns. And look at what it says he did, that he came up against Jerusalem and he sacked the temple and the private residence of Rehoboam and took all the wealth out of Jerusalem. And he didn't utterly destroy it because he wants them to pay tribute. Okay, it says right there in verse what is this? Verse 8. It says, "Nevertheless, they shall be servants to him." Him is the Shishak, and they is the kingdom of Judah. So they're going to be paying tribute back to him. But in order to do that, he has to completely wipe them out, conquer all the fortified cities, which is it says he did, and then get into Jerusalem and break through the wall, which he did, and took all the wealth out. The problem is when you compare this description of King or Pharaoh Shishak's escapades into Judah, and you compare it to Shoshank's escapade in northern Israel and all along the coast here, they are totally different military campaigns. And at the end of the day, what you come up with is the only thing that you can use to synchronize the two is their names kind of sound similar, which is just not a reason at all. I mean, if you look at give you an example. In English, if I say dog, it means dog. In Hebrew, if I say dog, it means fish. And to try to say because dog sounds the same that somehow a fish is a dog is kind of silly. Just because their names sound similar, or actually in this case the same, does not mean they're related. And when you look at the details of the military campaign of Shoshank I and the northern kingdom, and you look at the description of Shishak's, which is another pharaoh, a different pharaoh, it's not the same guy. He was in Judah, and he smoked the fortified cities in Judah and captured Jerusalem and took all of it, took a lot of booty out of the city, took a lot of wealth out of it. So there's a totally two different pharaohs for sure. And to think that they're not, you're just ignoring the text, and you're just adhering, you're ignoring the wall reliefs, and you're ignoring the text of Scripture, and you're just adhering to tradition because you want to, not because of what the archaeology and what the text says. So the reason why I was talking extensively about Shoshank and Shishak is because if you start promoting the idea that the shorter date ranges for the third intermediate period is the proper way we should look at this from an Egyptian chronology standpoint. The number one kickback that you'll get is in reference to the synchronism, the supposed synchronism between Shishak and Shoshank. And when you really look into the details of those two military campaigns of these different pharaohs into the Levant, they're very different. And the synchronism just is not there. But I wanted to make sure I went through why that synchronism is not valid. And it's really, as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. So the details is what determine whether or not those two pharaohs are the same. And really, at the end of the day, the only similarity between the two is their names, and that's really not a good way to do history or do archaeology. You have to look at the details, and we have the details of both, and they're definitely not the same. So how can we establish the new chronology validity, or keep the traditional view of chronology? The answer is astroarchaeology, and it's funny because it's actually a biblical idea. Here we see Genesis 1:14. I want to take your attention to the end of the verse, where it says, "Let them is be the stars, the celestial bodies that we see in the skies. Let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years." And that is really the key. What's really interesting, and this has really been ignored, is a lot of these royal houses all over the Levant, all over also into Greece and into Turkey, like the Hittites. They kept recordings, so they would write them down in a cuneiform tablet. Or if they were in Egypt, it would be in hieroglyphics. Something they would write down an eclipse, or they would write down the movements of the different constellations, or the movement of the planets, whether it be Venus or whatever. And nowadays we have everything nailed down. We realize that the movements of the constellations, which are really the movements of the planets, and eclipses and things like that, or blood moons, which is really a lunar eclipse, all these things are just like it says in Genesis 1:14. It's like a clock. It's a way that you can time things. So if you have an ancient culture that records an eclipse and says that it was the such and such day after the new moon, and give some other astrological details of where the constellation such and such was in the sky, you can very accurately date when that was, and then you can compare that to the chronology to know whether we're making an error in chronology or not. But this is really the key. This is really what we want to use as the gold standard when we can. Some things are not explicit enough to really nail it down. You have a bunch of possibilities. Some things are very accurate. So I'm going to give you an example of one of these. So this is a particular pharaoh, Neferhotep I. Traditional chronology has him reigning starting about 1747 BC, and he reigns for roughly 11 years, part of the 13th dynasty. It just so happens that one of the vassal kingdoms that were subservient to him is the guy that ran or was the king or ruler of Byblos, Amu. And the reason why we know that is because of this. So we have this part of this. I don't know if it's a wall relief or a statue. It's not really important, but it has Amu bowing before Neferhotep, and it basically says that he pays a tribute, that he's part of his vassal kingdom. So we know that to be a fact. What's also interesting is we have Amu giving gifts to King Zimrilim of Mari, which is a city-state in northern Syria. So we can synchronize, or should say, know that roughly at the same time that Neferhotep, Amu, I should say, and King Zimrilim of Syria are ruling at the same time. All these guys are alive at the same time. Here's an example. Here's some more information, I should say, on that. Zimrilim was king in Syria. Later in his life, the city, and we know this from again more writings we have, the city was sacked by King Hammurabi, which is the king of Babylon, and he sacked. He sacked the Mari and killed Zimrilim. So we know this happened. These are dates, and this also puts Hammurabi alive at the same time Neferhotep the first is around. And what's important is all of these guys, the dates, like for example, Hammurabi, they're having a date of 1772 to 1686, is based off Egyptian chronology, meaning we know these guys reigned at the same time. So we go look at what pharaoh, which was Neferhotep the first, and then based on the dates that are assigned to him, which is based on Egyptian chronology, we then therefore date Babylon. But again, if we use astroarchaeology, can we substantiate whether that should be upheld, this traditional view in the 1700s, or whether the newer chronology, because the newer chronology would have him reigning much closer to us. Just so happens that we do have some cuneiform tablets from Babylonian priests. So these are priests that are attached to the temple, part of the royal palace or the royal family. So these guys are the most educated people in antiquity. Are the priests that are in these capital cities of these different kingdoms all around the Middle East. They're the most educated, and they're also the wealthiest. So we really want to take serious what they say. But anyway, so they detail lunar and Venus observations, lunar meaning the moon, for a 16-year period. And as an example, tablet K160, which is one of the cuneiform tablets, date the first year of King. Oh boy, yeah, you can see it's Amesagdua. So, whatever, it doesn't matter. So anyway, we can date his reign to 1420 BC, and Hammurabi's reign started 146 years earlier because he was several kings down. So that puts Hammurabi's reign at 1566 is when it ends, or excuse me, when it starts, and it ends at 1524. That is roughly 200 years later than it was supposed to be. So what we can definitively say is that Neferhotep reigned somewhere around 200 years later than was once thought, establishing the validity of the new chronology. And again, that's based off of the movements of the stars and the constellations and the planets and eclipses and things like this. This stuff is rock solid. It's very predictable. You can go get different astrological software packages and date this. You can go online and NASA has a site that they put up there that you can look at, like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5,000 years of eclipses and things. All this stuff is predictable. We know exactly when it takes place, and this is a way that you can validate whether we should adhere to the traditional chronology for Egypt, or whether we should look at the new chronology for Egypt. And again, this is based off of reassessing some of the Dark Age periods in the Third and Second Intermediate period, as well as the New Kingdom. And the answer, just like I have there at the top, is astroarchaeology to determine which one is the one we should adhere to. Another example of astroarchaeology confirming the validity of the new chronology is as follows. But before going into it, let me give you some of the background information here. So what we have right here is we call a synchronicity in archaeology. So we have, this is the Hittite peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians. So here's the Hittite version that we found in the Royal Archive of Hattusha, which was destroyed and was burnt. But what it did is the burning of that actually helped preserve the cuneiform tablets of the archive that was attached to the palace. So because of that, we have literally hundreds of tablets, cuneiform tablets, that detail all aspects of the rulers of the Hittite Empire for a few hundred years. And also we have a lot of information in Egypt, because the low humidity and sand, the desert as it were, does a great job of preserving things. So we have this treaty on a wall relief in Egypt. That's the Egyptian version, and here's the Hittite version. So this allows us to synchronize who was Pharaoh, and which was Ramses II, Ramses the Great, and who was the king of Ugarit, which is down here is Supiluma I, he was a king of the Hittites during this particular battle of Kadesh. Now, their traditional date has it at 1274 BC, but again, that's not because of they're dating the battle in these particular treaties or this wall relief. It's because of using the traditional chronology. That's how they assign the date. What we can say for sure is not when the date of the battle took place, but which pharaoh was reigning and which king was reigning in Atusha, again, the capital of the Hittites. So that's what we do know. And because we have the detailed king lists of the Hittites based on the royal archive that we have, and we have a detailed king list of the pharaohs that reigned in Egypt in the 18th and 19th dynasties, we can synchronize those two. We know who reigned and for the Hittites and who was the pharaoh for the Egyptians. We can synchronize those two. Now, what we can bring in a third kingdom is in Ugarit. The reason why is because in the Royal Archive, we have a detailed correspondence between the between the kings, as it were, that reigned in Ugarit and the kings in the Hittite kings. We have the correspondence back and forth, so we can bring in the king lists of Ugarit, the king lists of the Hittites, and the pharaoh lists, and we know that Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nickmadu II of Ugarit were contemporary with each other. They were basically reigning at the same time. Now, why is that important? Well, let me show you why. So, in a cuneiform tablet we found in at the palace in Ugarit, again that was destroyed, was this particular tablet here, KTU 178, that was burned by fire, and from another cache of a few hundred cuneiform tablets that are known as the Amarna letters, we know when that fire happened. It was during I believe it was the 12th year of the reign of Akhenaten, and that this particular person that was a ambassador, or I should say probably the king or one of the rulers of the Canaanite city-states that were subservient to Egypt, wrote in the Amarna letter EA 151 back to Pharaoh Akhenaten, detailing the fire that had destroyed the palace in Ugarit during the reign of Nickmadu II. And we have this tablet that was destroyed at the same time the palace was. So we know this tablet was, within a few years, we know when it actually was written. So we can correlate the tablet KTU 178, Nickmadu II, and Pharaoh Akhenaten as being all contemporary with each other. Now, that's important because of what the tablet says. It details an eclipse. The text from KTU 178 says the following: there was an eclipse at sunset. That's a very definitive point in time that the eclipse happened. So as the sun is setting somewhere in that area, there was an eclipse at sunset on the day of the new moon. So it has to be the day of the new moon, which is also another data point, and the eclipse has to take place at sunset, and the third data point while Mars is visible. So we have an eclipse that has to take place at sunset on the first day of the new moon when Mars is visible and close to the sun. And what's interesting is that after they observed this, the priest then took a couple animals, just killed the animals, examined their livers, and they showed danger, and that was given to the king and put in the archive, which I find fascinating. So what's interesting is when you look through astrological software, which is like I was saying earlier, it's like a clock, and you say, okay, when did this eclipse take place? And if you do research in this, you'll find that people have tried to date it to the 1300s or the 1200s BC or in the 1100s BC. But if you look at the data of the eclipse, it was not on the first day. It was not on the day of the new moon, and it didn't take place at sunset. So they're pretty much ignoring the text of what the text says at KTU 1.78, and they're just looking for an eclipse that comes closer to the traditional chronology instead of taking the text of the tablet serious and saying, okay, where do we find an eclipse taking place at sunset on the first day of the new moon when Mars is visible? Well, plus or minus almost a millennia in either direction, there's only one date. So if you go backwards in time, 800-900 years, forward in time, 800-900 years, there's only one date or only one eclipse, I should say, that meets that equals or it adheres to the text of KTU 1.78, and you come up with May the 9th, 1012 BC. The problem with that, the reason why it becomes a hugely controversial thing, is because it's about 300 years later. Otherwise, we're moving the dates of Akhenaten 300 years closer to us, making him reigning and alive in 1012 BC, not in the 1350s. So, because of what that means, people that adhere to the traditional chronology have a really hard time with this, but there's really no answer to it. The text is the text, the synchronicities are the synchronicities, and there's no good reason not to take the data and take it seriously. But again, it just bucks against tradition, so people don't like to do it. Unfortunately, that's just the state we're in. But this eclipse data here from May the 9th, 1012 BC substantiate even further the validity of the new chronology. Here's an example. You can actually get this online, but there's showing the eclipse right here. So right there is the center of the eclipse, and here's the farthest westerly viewable part of the eclipse, and here's the farthest easterly point. And in there you see, this is the Middle East right here. This would be the coast of Syria. So it's at the far edge, meaning the sun is all the way in the west setting, which is exactly what the tablet, the cuneiform tablet, says. And here is a list of the new moons that took place at the same year, minus 1011 on May the 9th. And there you see, this is important to go over. So the way they do these datings and these things, it sometimes gets people confused. If you look here, the moon phases versus the date. So minus 1099 is equivalent to 1100. So it's because there's no year zero. You have to be aware of that. So all that being, a reason why I'm saying that is because where it says May the 9th minus 110 or minus 1011 is May the 9th 1012 BC. May the 9th 1012 BC for the new moon. So here we have the new moon verified. Again, this is like a clock. You can go back and figure it out. And the eclipse taking place at sunset. There's the data that substantiate that date is May the 9th 1012 BC. Again, it's just not taken seriously because it really messes with tradition. But this is the facts that we have on the ground, as it were, and they need to be taken more seriously, and they're not. This is one really good thing to show here. So what we have here is there's Akhenaten. We just talked about him. So the new chronology has him reigning from 1023 to 1006. The astrological observations, meaning the eclipse we just talked about, have him reigning from 1023 to 1006. So it pretty much backs that up. The conventional chronology is right here, and that's a difference of about 330 years. But I want to point your attention to Amenhotep up here, and Thutmose III up there. The reason why, and by the way, those guys, right here's Amenhotep, and here's Thutmose, and here's Akhenaten. They're all part of the 18th dynasty. So there are other astrological observations that I haven't gone into that have to do with Amenhotep and Thutmose III that validate the eclipse that I was talking about during the reign of Akhenaten. So these are other astrological observations that are detailed in the sands of Egypt about the reign of Amenhotep and Thutmose III here, which are again all part of the same dynasty. So we know how long these pharaohs reigned. We know who reigned before them, pharaoh-wise, and who reigned after. So what we're looking at is not just the eclipse during the reign of Akhenaten as this isolated event. We're looking at the astrological observations during the whole 18th dynasty that we have records for, and we have records for Amenhotep and Thutmose III, and this eclipse that we just talked about with Akhenaten. So when we harmonize all of those, we come up with the only date range. The only date range that makes sense is a new chronology. The traditional chronology does not. So the reason I want to point that out is it's just not the eclipse. It's the other astrological observations of Amenhotep I and Thutmose III that validate the new chronology. It's kind of like putting some extra nails on the coffin. And you can read the chart here. So it it shows that validity much stronger. And I know we didn't talk about it, but here is also another one. This is another pharaoh. This is during a totally different dynasty. So, but it does the astrological observations adhere to the new chronology, not the traditional chronology. And I think that's what's most important. Is it's just not this one isolated event, this one eclipse. It's that happened during the 18th dynasty timeline. There are many other observations from an astrological standpoint, and when you look at them all and you take serious the text and you try to line them up, there's only one time frame that pops out, and that's the chronology based, the new chronology, not the traditional chronology. So now let's go ahead and synchronize the biblical date for the Exodus. Again, that's based on harmonizing all of the passages that we see that relate to the Exodus and to make a consistent narrative. There's only one time frame we come up with. Again, the 1200 BC, 1250 BC Exodus is never stated in Scripture, and there is no archaeology that supports it. So it's really, being that the Bible doesn't say it, there's no archaeology. I don't even know why we're even discussing it. But still, today there's a lot of people that really adhere to that, which really makes no sense because for sure the Exodus did not happen at that time frame. But what is stated very explicit in Kings is that we have a Exodus of 1445 BC. So let's go ahead and synchronize that with David Roll's new chronology, again, which is backed up by the astrological observations. I want to take a minute to rabbit trail, so to speak, on some of the astrological observations. Doing this for dating is not a new thing. The issue has been they've never really taken it all that seriously. What I mean, I was looking at some charts that one particular Egyptologist had took some papyrus from a particular pharaoh's reign and detailed the particular astrological observations, and basically using astronomy software went and figured out what time frame those took place. But what he did is he picked a time frame that really coincided with a traditional chronology, and it only matched about 30% of the time. And he said, this is what the priest slash astrologers were talking about. And if the priests and astrologers, which are basically one and the same, the most educated people in antiquity are that bad at keeping time, because this is how they really kept their time is by the new moon cycle and by other astrological observations. If they were that bad at keeping time, how can you trust anything they say? And really, but again, no one ever stopped to think about that. But Dr. David Lappin, that's one of the guys that did basically recalculated those observations based on what's in this papyrus. And but he wasn't lassoed to a particular date. He wanted to see what date actually fits what the priests are saying, and that date range that he come up with coincide perfectly with the new chronology. And so again, it further backs that up. But I don't want to make sure you understand this. It's not that it's new. It's never really been taken all that serious before. And so now when you take it seriously and you use that to check the new chronology versus your traditional, all of it's lining up in the new chronology. So as we lay down this new chronology here, next to the biblical account, what we have here is a 12th dynasty, 12th dynasty, I should say, and this is based on the new chronology, and then the 13th dynasty, and the start of the Hyksos period, which is really the start of the second intermediate period, which is another Egyptian Dark Ages. This is when Egyptian society fell apart because of the Hyksos coming in. It really was a bad time for the Egyptians, and there's a reason for that, and we'll be documenting that, or going through that, I should say. So if you synchronize the two, that's about the time frame that you have the arrival of Joseph in Egypt. And then shortly after that, I don't know however many years it was, after he gets out of prison, and the whole thing about telling the Pharaoh's dream and all that kind of stuff that we have in Genesis 41, that's about the time frame that happens when he becomes vizier in Egypt, which basically means he's second in command behind the Pharaoh. And shortly after that, we have Joseph bringing his brothers and his whole family into the land of Goshen. That's detailed in Genesis 46. And then we have them, they multiply quite greatly in Goshen, and they found the city of Avaris, which is not in the biblical account. It just says they multiplied greatly in Exodus 1:7. So if you look at this pattern here that you see here, that Joseph coming into Egypt, him becoming vizier. And again, Joseph is Semitic, he's an Asiatic. He's Hebrew, so he's not Egyptian. So you see this foreigner come in, he becomes second in command, and his family and his descendants and his relatives, I should say, multiply greatly and become very large, and they settle in the land of Goshen. So what happens is, do we see this kind of pattern when we synchronize the two? And the answer is yes. There's the city in the land of Goshen that the Jews found. It's called the city of Avaris, which sits underneath Ramses, because later on in Egyptian chronology, you have Ramses the Great, which is Ramses II, which is really the greatest, in my opinion, and most people that are Egyptologists, and I'm not, but most people would agree with that he is the greatest pharaoh. He built Ramses, the city of Ramses, right on top of it, which is why the biblical account doesn't say that they built the cities of Pithom and Avaris, because Ramses put another city right on top of Avaris and renamed it. So many hundreds of years later, no one knows this anymore. So that's why the biblical account there in Exodus was changed from Avaris to Ramses, which probably took place somewhere in the 800s BC, would be my guess time frame. But this city in the land of Goshen shows up exactly at the time it's supposed to. And Avaris at this time is a very large city. In fact, it's probably one of the largest cities in all of antiquity at that time. So this is not a little podunk town. This is a very, very large city. One of the largest in the world at the time. Also, you see this. There is the Semitic house, which is it's a Syrian style house, based on what you see in the land of Canaan, which is where Joseph and his family come from. And this is a very lush palace that you would expect this Semitic vizier, this guy that's second in command, to have, which I believe this is, again, this is a reconstruction. Obviously, from an archaeological standpoint, it doesn't look like that, but the archaeologists had an artist rendition done, and that's what they came up with, which is very much a style of Semitic house, and a very large one, very plush one. In fact, a little side note: the bed was one of the largest beds in antiquity, which I find kind of ironic. There's the courtyard of this particular visitor's house, which happens to be Semitic. What a coincidence! Again, all this is just amazing how it lines up exactly to the biblical account. What a coincidence. Anyway, in the backyard there, in red, you have tombs, and when you take the one in blue and the ones in red, add them up, there's 12. Again, we have the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, it's exactly what you'd suspect. The one in blue is actually a pyramid tomb. It's actually a tomb of the vizier, of the guy that owns the house, which again, I believe is Joseph. And the archaeologists had an artist reconstruct what the statue looked like that was inside the pyramid tomb, because it had been destroyed, but there was quite a bit of it still there, enough to do a reconstruction. And there's Joseph. So this is a Semitic person, and but he is an Egyptian ruler, not a pharaoh, but he's high up there. And again, he was a second command. He's got the throw stick, which is emblematic of a foreigner, specifically coming from Canaan, and he's got the non-Egyptian hair. He's actually a redhead, but he's definitely a Semitic person. He's got the coat of many colors and many tassels, which is, you could translate that either way, and this has both of them. So this is exactly whether through the city of Avaris, the house, this large Semitic house for the vizier, the 12 tombs in the backyard, the fact that this particular vizier looks exactly like you would expect a Semitic person to look like. All this just lining up perfectly is not a coincidence. And this is not the only thing. There is a lot more to come. But again, this begins a pattern, starting with Joseph coming into Egypt, going all the way down here, which is in this area, what happens after the Jews leave Egypt, and we have the Red Sea crossing and the Exodus event. So we're going to go through that whole period and look at the archaeology once we take the new chronology, again, which has been backed up by the astro archaeology, and look at the biblical date of 1445, which is what Scripture says. Put the two next to each other and see what we get. So now, if you move down into the from the 12th dynasty, which is where Joseph was at, down to the 13th dynasty, this is where the bad stuff starts happening. Okay, now our pharaoh arose because we're in a different dynasty, right? That was the king over Egypt and didn't know Joseph, and made the Jews slaves. This is detailed in Exodus 1:8 through 14. And then we have the Exodus there happening after that, sometime after that, and that's detailed in Exodus 12:33. And then after that, obviously very quickly after that, we have the crossing of the Yom Suf, which is what it says in Hebrew. It means Sea of Reeds, but most translations say Red Sea, but it's really Sea of Reeds. So we have these events happening in the 13th dynasty, which makes sense when you look at the text where it says there was a pharaoh that came into power that did not know Joseph. Why? Because he wasn't part of the 12th dynasty, or the 12th dynasty, I should say. He was part of the 13th, so it's from a different royal house, a different family, and the allegiance that once was there, is now gone. So there, down at the bottom, we have the date of the Exodus, 1445 BC. Now, what's interesting when you look at that, we know from the biblical account that the Pharaoh died and his firstborn son had died earlier from the curse of the firstborn, and the whole Egyptian army was destroyed in the Red Sea or the Reed Sea crossing. And also, we have the Jews leaving with a bunch of gold and jewelry and a bunch of wealth from Egypt. Plus, they were a lot of the labor force in the Egyptian economy. So you have all this happening at once, which created an absolute collapse in Egyptian society, which is why we see the Hyksos come in. The Hyksos actually are people's other Semites. So as the Jews are leaving Egypt, the word gets out, which the Bible makes very clear that happens, and the people that are the non-Jews in the land of Canaan take advantage of the situation to go and eat in Egypt and plunder it, and they decide to stay, and they stay there for over 100 years. That's where this second intermediate period starts, and it's known as when the Hyksos come in, and this marks what happens right after the biblical Exodus. So what I guess to substantiate that, this particular fragmentary papyrus is called the Royal Canon of Turin, and this lays out the pharaohs in the column to the right there within the 13th dynasty. And right down there, there's a particular pharaoh that's detailed by this guy here, Artapanus of Alexandria, he was alive around 200 BC. He names this particular pharaoh, and I'm always bad at pronouncing these names. I think it's Knefra Sobehakotep the Fourth. Anyway, there's only two pharaohs in all of Egyptian history that have this name. The other one is back in the Old Kingdom, I think around in the 2000s BC, which is no way that even lines up. But this one does. This is exactly where you'd expect it to be after we synchronize the two chronologies, the new chronology along with the biblical account. And it just so happens we have an Egyptian historian that is writing for the Ptolemaic family, the Ptolemies, which are running Egypt at the time. This is after the death of Alexander the Great, that are talking about this particular pharaoh that is the stepfather or grandfather, depending how you want to take it, of that actually raised Moses, and he names him out. And what's interesting is this really wasn't taken seriously because under the traditional chronology, they don't line up. So there were most Egyptologists think the guy just was not doing good history for whatever reason. And now when we look at the new chronology and the true biblical dates stated in scriptures of 1445, and we synchronize them, it lines up perfectly, which I find absolutely fascinating. Another thing that shows up, if you go later around 45 years, you get to the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and his name is Dudimos. He's the 40th king of that particular of the 13th dynasty, and it's about 45 years after it. This is the guy that's a Pharaoh of the Exodus. He's a no-name Pharaoh, which makes sense because he died early, and he was pretty much the last king of the 13th dynasty. And then you have the Hyksos come in. It's exactly what you would expect given what happened in Egyptian society. And when we synchronize the biblical account along with the Egyptian chronology, the new Egyptian chronology, it is exactly what we see. This is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Yeah, this is a good one here. So we have is this is an Egyptian priest. It's a little bit earlier. It's around 250 BC, and again he's quoted by Josephus. He's writing about a particular event during the reign of Dudimos, this really a relatively unknown pharaoh that really no one took serious because the accounts didn't synchronize. But now that they do synchronize, when you read this, you can go ahead and read that. I got that highlighted in blue. Paraphrasing it, what it basically says is that God smote the Egyptians unexpectedly. Well, if you really understand the biblical account, you know it's really it's because of the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. But from this pagan Egyptian priest looking back on the history that he knows, and what happened, and you see as you read through there that the Hyksos coming in were able to take control of Egypt without striking a blow. Why? Because the army has been destroyed. Pharaoh is dead. The firstborn is dead. Who knows what's going on within the family, the 13th dynasty, who's trying to take over power? When you have no more army, your economy is collapsed. All your economy is collapsed. All your slave labor is gone, along with a bunch of gold, all the wealth. Yeah, you can come in and take control of Egypt without even striking a blow. And then they destroyed everything and took people into slavery and killed the ones that weren't taken into slavery, which is exactly what you'd expect to happen, given what the biblical account says happened in Egypt. And we have this papyrus, this Royal Canon of Turin, that and these two Egyptian historians that are basically chronology, not really chronology, is just stating Egyptian history, and they just know whenever you line up the two, the Egyptian chronology, the new one, along with the biblical account, when you line those two up, both these Egyptian historians that are giving an account of what happened in the past, just so happens to line up perfectly with what you would expect to have happen. What an amazing coincidence. Again, it's not by accident because this is the real history of what happened to Egypt after the Exodus and the collapse of Egyptian society. Now let's go ahead and look at now that we went through the Egyptian history from Joseph all the way down to the Exodus. Now let's get into the conquest, and we're going to specifically look at this area here, referred to as the MBA, and that doesn't mean Masters in Business Administration. It's in reference to the Middle Bronze Age, but more specifically, the time frame is referred to as the MBA 2B. Date range, which goes from 1750 BC to 1650. But we're going to minus roughly the 300 years, which is what you have to do with the new chronology, and we're going to look at the archaeological things that happen between, based on the traditional chronology, 1750 BC to 1650 BC, but based on the new chronology, that's really 1450 BC to 1350 BC. And we have the this time frame at the Exodus. We have the 40 years wandering in the desert, and then around 1400 BC or so is when you have the conquest. So that's what we're going to really focus on, to see what lines up with the conquest based on the biblical account when you synchronize it with the new chronology. Again, so this is this area right here. Also, because of the Egyptian society collapse in this window of time, this 100-year period, is also when you have the Hyksos come into Egypt, which is the start of the second intermediate period, and the Canaanites come in there and take over Egypt and rule it. Also, when you have in that same time frame, again, as the beginning of the conquest of Jericho, which is a very famous story. And what's amazing is this is the era when Jericho was destroyed. When you synchronize a new chronology with the biblical account, they match up perfectly, even in the conquest. So Jericho gets destroyed exactly when you expect it to get destroyed. But what's interesting is the archaeology that's inside of Jericho. So what we have is the excavations at Jericho reveal a network of collapsed walls, which is exactly what the biblical account says. They blew the horn and the walls fell down. The whole story there, which is kind of a strange story, but the archaeological account is backing up the biblical account. In the right archaeological period is when we see the walls collapsed. They're saying it's due to an earthquake, which could have happened just at the same time that the blowing of the horn happens too. There was an earthquake and the walls came down, which would be very consistent with scripture. But what I find amazing is exactly what we see in the archaeology backs up the biblical account perfectly. And there we see over here on the side. This is kind of an artist rendition of the two-walled system you see over here, and here's the really a cutaway of it. And there you see the where the wall comes down there, right in this area here. This is where the wall falls down. The top wall falls down to the bottom wall, and the Jews just go right up the wall and burn the town and destroy Jericho and do everything that it says they did in Joshua, which is really amazing because again the what we have after we synchronize these two chronologies, the new chronology with the biblical account, we have archaeology and the biblical account in its overall pattern and also in its details matching exactly the way we would expect it to. What also is interesting is when they excavated the city, they found this. This is a storage jar that that contains food product from the harvest, from the spring harvest, that they went ahead and put in the storage jars. And what this does is it was burnt with fire and it was full. So what that does is to coincide that with scripture is in scripture in Joshua 6, it really details the siege. It was a short siege, so you'd expect the grain to be full from the spring harvest, and it had to have happened right around Passover, because in Joshua 5 is when they have the Passover before they take care of the issue at Jericho. So this is when the spring harvest happens. So you'd expect the product to be there and the storage jars to be full, and you'd expect them to be burnt with fire because the city was burnt with fire and it was a short siege, which is exactly what is backed up with the archaeology of the site within the Middle Bronze Age MBA 2B strata level. It's exactly what we'd expect to see, and that's what's there. So now we're going to move from Jericho to Hatzor, or Hazor in English, and this is another one of the cities in the conquest. But I wanted to, finish up Jericho. One of the reasons why most archaeologists will say that the Exodus never happened is because of Jericho, because when you use traditional chronology and you use the traditional view of the biblical Exodus around 1250 BC, Jericho is nothing. Oh, I should say not the Exodus, but the conquest that happens 40 years after the Exodus. Jericho is a wasteland. It had not been inhabited for 100 and 200 years, and it was not going to be inhabited for another 400 or 500 years later. So it's a pile of nothing at the time, which is why the traditional archaeologists will point to the biblical Exodus as it's a great history that never happened, as one of those that talk about it, quote it in that way. And the reason why they say that is one of the main reasons, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons is Jericho, because there's just nothing there. But whenever we really dive into the details of the third intermediate period, as Egyptologist David Roll did. In fact, a little side note, his PhD thesis was on the third intermediate period, so he speaks with a level of expertise. And he's not the only one. There's other Egyptologists that would hold to this, to the new chronology. It kind of breaks loose all of the presuppositions that traditional archaeology has, and really you can look at things with a fresh eye and see if there's any synchronism between the biblical Exodus and the new chronology. And as we've already showed so far, there's a lot. But in my opinion, what we're going to talk about here at Hatzor is really this is a synchronism we should use, not between Shoshank and Shishak, which the only thing similar there is the names sound the same. But when you look at like we already talked about, when you look at the military conquests that are detailed in scriptures and chronicles, and also look at the wall reliefs in Egypt, you can tell very, very easily that this is not the same military campaign, and therefore it's not the same pharaoh. But this we have the kind of synchronicity that really everything should be based off what we have here in Hatzor. And the reason why is because of this. This is a cuneiform tablet that you can see there. This is a tablet right here. Cuneiform is a script that was used, and the language is Akkadian. And at this particular time in the Bronze Age, Akkadian was a diplomatic language in between the different royal houses all over antiquity, between Egypt and the Hattusha, which is a capital of the Hittites, or to Babylon, or to the ancient Minoans. Take your pick. The Canaanite city-states is another example. That's in Hatzor was one of the Canaanite city-states. That's how the royal houses communicated back and forth with each other, is using cuneiform tablets in the language of in the language of Akkadian. This was the diplomatic language, and this tablet here is addressed to the king of Hatzor, and in Akkadian it's Yabni. Okay, so this is the king of Hatzor, and this tablet was found in the stratification layers, and specifically in the Middle Bronze Age at the 2B area. So what's really awesome about that from an archaeological standpoint is this allows you to not only put a name to a person, but also allows you, as in the king, also allows you to put a date to it, because we know it's in the Middle Bronze Age 2B era. And what's interesting is when you synchronize that with the biblical account of the conquest at Hatzor by Joshua. He is named here in English, in the English translation, as Jabin, and he's the king of Hatzor. And it basically says that Hatzor was burned with fire, and Joshua killed Jabin with the sword. So what's interesting is when you look at the king's names, Jabin is Yabin, and Yabin is Yabni. This is it's just a Canadian pronunciation of the Hebrew way of pronunciation, pronouncing the king of Hatzor, which is Yabin. They are one and the same person. And then to really emphasize even more is this right here. This is 4Q23, and you can see it's turned sideways there, but this is Paleo-Hebrew, which basically means this is a document that is using a script that was only used before the destruction of the first temple, which is before 586 BC. So that means para-Joshua, which is kind of like a retelling of Joshua, kind of a commentary on it. In order to have a manuscript like that, you have to have the original story or the original book of Joshua that you're retelling or recounting. So this definitively puts the book of Joshua at the very, if you want to be uber liberal, maybe in the 700s BC, but there is no reason, given the script being paleo, that you would not put it shortly after Joshua died, maybe a generation or two, as they're compiling the history of Joshua and putting it into one corpus, or it could be even during Joshua's life. Even he could have had the Levitical priests, which are obviously going to have the ability to write and to record exactly what's going on, or it could be shortly after that that this stuff is recorded. Nonetheless, we can say for sure 800, 1000, 1200 BC in that time frame is whenever the writings of Joshua put into a corpus, and they name this Yabni, this king of Hatzor. So there you have a synchronism. You have a text stating who killed this particular king of Hatzor and when they killed him. So there's really using the same kind of methodology they used to synchronize Shoshank and Shishak. They should synchronize this in the same way. And if you synchronize Hatzor and the king that was killed by Joshua here, Yabni, or Yabin, I should say, depending on how I pronounce it, if you synchronize those two and base all of the history going back to Jericho, the Exodus, going back to Joseph, and the whole story as laid out there in the last part of the book of Genesis, all the way through really the book of Exodus and into the wandering, the 40 years of wandering, and then into the book of Joshua, and you really look at all the history that's there, it synchronizes with the archaeology perfectly, and we have a name of a king that was killed by Joshua found in the right strata level, and we know that the book of Joshua goes back into the time frame you'd expect it to be. There's really no reason that you wouldn't use these two pieces of evidence to synchronize the history, biblically speaking, along with the archaeology. There's just no good reason not to, and especially when you look at the larger picture, it's very obvious this is what you should do. But again, this is a minority view. As just like with the minority view at one time being that the Earth was round, because the Catholic Church said no, it's not, or that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, which is what the Church believed at that time, and the minority, the rebels, these new young upstarts, said no, it's not. But over time, over a generation or two, those things change, and I'm sure that we'll hear as you have the younger scholars coming up in the ranks and don't have this history so heavily ingrained in them, are willing to take a fresh look at things. I'm sure this will take hold as things move forward from a historical standpoint. But right now it's not. But this is a synchronicity between the Egyptian chronology, or I should say chronology of the Middle East, and the archaeology and Egypt being part of that, and the biblical account. This is the synchronicity that should be used, but it's unfortunately it's not. I know we just talked about the synchronicity or the synchronization between Hatzor and Yabin, which is the king of Hatzor, and the fact that he is contemporary with Joshua because Joshua killed him. And that puts both of them in the Middle Bronze Age, to be more specifically the 2B strata level. This synchronicity should really be taken seriously, along with all the other stuff that I've been speaking about in this presentation. And what's interesting is that means shortly after that, just like I had mentioned a few minutes earlier, that shortly after that, that's whenever you have the corpus of Joshua in all likelihood being put together, would be shortly, maybe a generation or two after his life, or it could be during his generation. It's really basically an educated guess either way. But that does put the book of Joshua in the middle to late Bronze Age. And if the book of Joshua is there in the middle to late Bronze Age, so is the Torah. So is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so I want to look at drive that point home a little bit further and look at some evidence that points in that direction that really substantiates the validity of this statement here. You see there in blue, the Bronze Age and the Bible, that the Bible was in the Bronze Age. Obviously not the New Testament, and obviously not a lot of the prophets and so forth, but more specifically would be the Torah, the book of Joshua, and I also think you can probably put in there Judges towards the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and also probably First Kings, and some of the books, some of the Psalms actually goes back to Moses, so you could put some of those in there. So that early foundation of the Bible does go back to the Bronze Age, middle to late Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And I wanted to give a little bit more evidence given the backdrop that we just created with the new chronology and the biblical Exodus date of 1445 BC. What else we can look at that really harmonizes very well with that. So what we have here is a little story, or a little background information on this to create the historical backdrop. In this little story here that you see in 2 Kings is this is what's going on after the northern kingdom just got destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. And what Assyria would do is take all the males typically out of an area and bring in people from other lands to kind of make sure there's no rebellion later on. So after the Assyrian Empire smote northern Israel, so to speak, they bring in these foreigners, and they're getting, if you read the read this little passage here, plus a little bit before, a little bit after, you'll see that they're getting eaten by lions, and they send a message to the king of Assyria and say, "Hey, send us one of the priests that was originally here to go ahead and teach us the ways of this local God, which would be the God of Israel, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah, and to go ahead and teach us His ways because we need to appease Him so He can keep the lions from killing us." And what's interesting is they don't bring a Levitical priest from the south down in Judea and Jerusalem, which is still an independent nation at the time. They bring one of these other priests. Now, these priests are still believers in the God of Israel, but they're not Levitical priests, and the Levitical priests would call them heretics because they're not from the tribe of Levi, which is a violation of the Torah. So I definitely would be more in agreement with the Levites of being heretics, but they're still in referencing what they're a priest of as the God of Israel. And these line of priests were created by the kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. So the people that live in the northern Israel, the northern kingdom, wouldn't go down in Jerusalem and Judea for the biblical festivals and would not adhere to the Levitical priesthood, which is located in Jerusalem. That we need a new priesthood that the people in northern kingdom can, so to speak, join themselves to. And so we need a new priesthood. We need a new epicenter for our biblical feasts, so to speak. So they create a new temple. That's a different temple, a new priesthood, and that's what's going on for a few hundred years until the king of Assyria sacks them. And so in this passage shows you that there's this other priesthood. So he brings them in to appease them. And this is where you have the beginning of the Samaritans that you see that are so reviled by the Jews in the times of the New Testament. So around 700 and some years later is whenever you see the issue between the Jews and the Samaritans. But this is kind of where it starts, is this heretical priesthood. But this heretical priesthood that also had before they got destroyed by Assyria, a heretical temple, also had a alternate or a secondary Torah that's actually still around today. So today, if you go in the Middle East, in Israel, in that area, you'll find you have the typical Masoretic text, which is with the Torah and most English, in fact, all English translations are based off of, is the traditional rabbinic Bible, as it were. That's the Masoretic text. But there also is in Israel the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is a Samaritan Torah, and that is this other Torah that the Samaritans create. Now, it's pretty much identical with the rabbinic Bible or the rabbinic Torah. There's really not much of a difference, but there are some differences, and there's interesting where they're at. But it is a different strain of the scriptures. So I want to kind of paint that backdrop so you can understand what I'm saying. We have in the northern kingdom, we have a different priesthood, different temple, and a slightly different Torah. So this is the beginning of the northern kingdom. This is the first king, Jeroboam. So basically what you have after the death of Solomon, Rehoboam takes over, and the people basically say, "Hey, look, give us a break. Your dad taxed us too much." And Rehoboam doesn't. That causes a split in the kingdom between the north, the 10 tribes, and the south, the 2 tribes. And this is the first king. And the reason why I'm showing this little I think they call these bullas. This is actually what you would use to make an impression in wax when you're sending a correspondence somewhere. You don't want it to be read by anybody else. This is your seal, as it were. And this substantiates that there was a real king of Israel. There was a real king Jeroboam. This is one of the guys in his court, Shema, which is one of the servants of Jeroboam, one of the guys in his court. This is his seal because he's attached to the royal house of Jeroboam. And you see Jeroboam's reign there in 922 to 901 BC. But this was a real king. We have the real archaeology. It's really not even debatable. Some more history on that. Shortly after Jeroboam kicks the bucket, as it were. We have King Omri, which is probably one of the most famous from an archaeological standpoint. We have a lot of information about this guy. Omri shows up. He's the king of Israel from 884 BC to 873. He actually found Syria, makes that the capital of the northern kingdom. And we even have this little wall relief here from the Assyrian Empire. I think this is actually out of Nineveh, and it shows that the son of Omri paying homage to the king of Assyria. So this, again, just give you a little bit of the historical and archaeological backdrop. This is a real event, and again, in the northern kingdom, they had a secondary or a different priesthood than the Levitical priesthood, a different temple, and also had a different Torah. And this right here is part of that. This is 4Q22. It's probably the scribe that originally copied it around 225 BC, but the parent document that this scribe used was in the same script as this one, which is known as Paleo-Hebrew, meaning that it's in Paleo-Hebrew, which was the Hebrew that was only used before the destruction of the first temple, which puts it in around being used 600 BC all the way back to the time of the judges, 1200s, 1300s BC. So this is a time frame that this particular Hebrew script is used. So scholars recognize, being the fact that this is in Paleo-Hebrew, that the transmission stream, otherwise the parent document that this is copied from, and then that parent document and that parent document, all of these go back and are consistently copied in the same script, being Paleo-Hebrew. And we know this is the part of the early Samaritan Pentateuch, which is why scholars call this Proto-Samaritan. Another reason why we know it's really early is there's no commandment to build the altar in Mount Gerizim, which is one of the things that the Northern Kingdom did to differentiate itself from the Jews in the south. So being that that commandment is not there, being that this is in Paleo-Hebrew, this is, again, the part of the Torah of the Northern Kingdom, we know that this is in the 600-700s BC at the very minimum. And really looking at the history, being that we have the creation of the Northern Kingdom around 900 BC, we have a secondary priesthood created that's not the Levitical priesthood, we have a different temple created, and we know from the scriptus in the 600s or 700s BC, there's no reason that we can't take this all the way back to Jeroboam when he created this priesthood. It makes logical sense that is whenever he had that done, he also had scribes rework the Torah, because this is kind of a reworked Torah as another way of saying this. So we know this took place. We know there was a secondary priesthood. We know there was another temple created. So there's no reason, logically, historically, from an archaeological standpoint, not to take this all the way back to 900 BC or so. And if that's when this Torah was created, you have to have the southern Jewish, or the Levitical version of the Torah that comes down from Aaron and Moses and all the happenings around there. You have to have a Torah in place to copy it from. So that puts the Torah definitively existing in the 900s BC in written form. And if you have it definitively existing, for sure, in the 900s BC, there's no reason not to take that all the way back to the Bronze Age. And we see already that you have this stuff from Joshua we just talked about that is already going on at that time, with the synchronization between Hatzor and Yabin, the king of Hatzor, and the fact that it's in the book of Joshua. This is just more evidence putting the Torah back in the time in written form that the Bible says it should be. We can substantiate that from history and from archaeology. Oh, by the way, there you see, this is in blue here. That's the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, the very name of God. When you put the vowels in there, that would be pronounced Yehovah. Some more evidence that that points to this. Here we see Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Genesis all in this Paleo-Hebrew form, which puts their parent document transmission stream that they come from into the 600s and 700s BC. And as we've just talked about with the Pentateuch or the Torah from the Northern Kingdom, there's no reason to take the Torah and some of the early books besides the Torah, like Joshua and some of the in the Book of Judges, back into the Late Bronze Age, back into the early Iron Age. There's no reason not to. Historically, you can very easily, especially with this new chronology, very easily paint that picture from a historical and archaeological standpoint. And by the way, this is called the Silver Scroll. There you see at the bottom. It's the oldest scripture we have that we have in written form, in reference to its date of composition. So it's 650 BC, and this was put on this little silver scroll, made into a necklace in war, and this was part of the grave goods that was found in a tomb near Jerusalem. And it's the Aaronic blessing found in number 6. But there again, if you're copying the Aaronic blessing from number 6 onto this little silver scroll, the book of Numbers has to be already existing in order to do it. Again, just more evidence pointing towards the antiquity of Scripture. And when you get into the possibility and looking at the evidence for the Torah being in existence during the Late Bronze Age in written form, and also the Book of Joshua, as well as probably some of the early Psalms, a lot of the Book of Judges is already going to be have taken place and probably already in written form. I would probably say also first getting into the right before First Kings is created, because that's created around the time getting into Saul and King David. When you do that, you run into this issue that scholars will say is that, hey, in order to have a Torah, you have to have an alphabet. And the Jews weren't there, and they hadn't adopted the alphabet yet. And the reason why is that they have a issue with that is because of the issue with the 1200 BC Exodus, and there's no archaeological evidence. So some of this early alphabet here that was found, and this is found in the Sinai Peninsula attached to Egypt. This is a turquoise mine, and there you see part of the pagan temple that was there at the time. But inside the mine, what you'll find is this Hebrew graffiti, and this is scholars call it Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic, but it's really Hebrew. I mean, if anybody that's a rabbi that knows Paleo-Hebrew can read this stuff. So it's there's, and the only reason they won't call it Hebrew is because they don't think the Jews were ever in Egypt, that the whole story is just a farce. Again, that's because the errors they make in chronology and other errors. But whenever you fix these mistakes that have happened in archaeology in its early history, going back to the mid to late 1800s and all the way up through today, and you use the new chronology, you use the biblical Exodus date that is very plainly stated of 1445 BC, synchronize all of that to create this panoramic view of what I've been talking about. If you do that, it's what you would expect is to see the alphabet in this turquoise mine. And what's interesting is these are not highly educated people. These are slaves in a turquoise mine that know how to write this and in this archaic form of Hebrew, and to make these inscriptions on the wall, showing a couple things: A, that the Jews were there. And this is shortly. This is after the time of Joseph. This is when you'd expect them to be enslaved. A, they're there. B, even a slave knows how to write, which is also quite interesting. And these are the Jews that are doing this, especially when you again resynchronize everything. So it's, when you look at that, it's not a big deal, or it's not a big stretch, I should say, to have the Torah in written form, and have the rest of the story play itself out, the story of the Exodus, and in the synchronicity that I've already talked about with Hatzor and with Joshua. It's not a stretch. There's a lot of evidence pointing towards that, and this is part of that story. So, why is there such a hard pushback from the archaeologists and different scholars that uphold the traditional dating? And the reason why is because if you accept the new chronology, what it means, and I'll give you an example. Here is 5 books that are written on the collapse of the Bronze Age. And funny, this guy here, I was listening to a talk that Eric Klein was doing about his book, year 1177, the year civilization collapsed. He was stating that he had to wait a while before he was going to publish the title because the Egyptian chronologists were going to change it from 1177 to 1187, and he ended up not changing it, obviously. But it just shows you how completely and utterly dependent everybody's chronology on all over the Levant, up into Anatolia, which is where the Hittites are, into ancient Greece, into the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, the Babylonians, the Hittites, all the Canaanite city-states. Everything is based off Egyptian chronology. And what's interesting is what the traditional chronology comes up with whenever you apply it to the rest of civilization at the time during the late Bronze Age, as you come up with this. Basically, at the late Bronze Age, if you adhere to the traditional chronology, every civilization collapsed at once overnight. That is an event in human history that has never happened before. And this is what you end up with if you would adhere to the traditional chronology. And the issue is the third intermediate period, because you're making it longer by about 250 years longer than it really is. It creates this gap where there is nothing taking place anywhere in the world except for Egypt. And again, because they have this chronology error, everything else is stopped because of this error in chronology, and you have all of the world basically ceasing to exist. It's like somebody pressed a button and everybody died. And it just so happens that they try to make this as a cause of the Sea Peoples, which are a conglomeration of the Philistines and some other people groups that are going around and sacking or making war against different city-states up and down the Mediterranean coast. And which it doesn't make any sense, because there's always wars going on. Every year there's more wars during the Bronze Age and going into the Iron Age. Here's an example: during the time of King David, it says that David did not go out to make war in the spring, which was very much customary. Instead, he stayed back at the palace, which is why he had the affair with Bathsheba. But it just shows you that war was as normal as breathing at that particular time. So there's nothing unusual about the Sea Peoples attacking these different coastal cities. There's nothing unusual with that. But the reason why they try to make that the reason is because, adhering to the traditional chronology, it makes civilization after these attacks completely cease to exist. But there's no way. It just doesn't make any sense. They wouldn't. Nobody utterly destroys somebody. They want to actually take their wealth and maybe make them subservient to them. But pretty much all at once, to go around all over the Middle East and making all over the Levant, all over the Mediterranean, make every civilization cease to exist completely for a few hundred years. And people have realized that there must be something else there besides the Sea People, so they tried to make it, well, maybe it's an earthquake, or maybe it was famine, or maybe it was a giant volcano erupted. Some people have tried to make the eruption of Santorini the issue, which is not, because it's a few hundred years earlier than that. The issue is they're always trying to. This is a big mystery in traditional chronology. What caused the collapse of civilization overnight? And what amazes me is no one ever stopped to think, maybe the chronology is wrong, especially when you get into the areas of the second and third intermediate period, these Egyptian Dark Ages. I mean, I can see you wanting to not mess with the chronology during the New Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom. At least that makes more sense anyway, just because we have a stable Egyptian dynasty that rules the whole of Egypt. But during the third intermediate period, the second intermediate period, it's not the case. And you would think you would re-examine that, especially given what the outcome of that chronology view is that you create a collapse of civilization that you're basically making up out of thin air. And this is this is why there's so much pushback, is because there are literally probably a few hundred, if not more, PhDs that have gotten their thesis on things that never happened. I mean, can you imagine if your PhD thesis was on the Dark Ages of Greece that occurred after this Bronze Age collapse, and then you come to realize that it never even existed? Yeah, that would be a problem. And so there's this huge pushback from these antiquities departments that specialize in the Levant and the Middle East. They just will not adapt this chronology because mostly because of emotional reasons, because it it reorganizes everything. It would be like somebody launched a nuclear bomb in the history department. It's a huge deal, and that's why there's so much of a hard pushback. And they actually get to where they give you, they attack you with personal attacks. They try to think you're an idiot or make you look that way just because there's it means them giving up everything. It's kind of like the Catholic Church holding on to the idea that the Earth is flat and it's not round. It's that kind of an idea. But I think as time moves on, and as we have just history roll out, I think more and more people will adapt to the new chronology because it does make the most sense given the whole picture, and it will make this whole Bronze Age collapse thing just go away, which it should have. I mean, even if you put the Bible aside, what the scriptures say, you put the new chronology aside, put everything over aside, and just look at this is an event, the collapse, this Bronze Age collapse, the end of the Bronze Age, that there is nothing like it in human history. And because of that, and the only thing that you're using to justify this view is Egyptian chronology, you would think you would examine that more, just on that by itself. But sorry to say, that didn't happen. So, to summarize the whole presentation I've been going through, um, we can rest assured that that is a biblical date of the Exodus, plus or minus a few years. The new chronology of Egypt is, in all likelihood, again, everything when it comes to studying history is degrees of probability. This has an incredibly high degree of probability given the whole narrative that goes along with it. And there is massive archaeological evidence for the Exodus, when 1445 Exodus, when you synchronize the new chronology with the true biblical Exodus date. They fit together like a hand in a glove. So what that basically states, I guess the summary of all of that, is not only did the Exodus happen, but that means the Torah, the first 5 books, the book of Joshua, some of the book of Judges, and some of the Psalms were in written form during the Middle to Late Bronze Age, more in the Late Bronze Age and going into the early Iron Age. This puts the foundation of the Bible, like I said, in written form in the time it's supposed to be, in the time that the scriptures say it was in existence. When you look at this, given this new data, it really puts that that idea in concrete, as it